Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this Dzone virtual roundtable sponsored by Retool. We're thrilled to dive into an increasingly crucial topic in the tech community with the release of our latest trend report, Low Code Development, Elevating the Engineering Experience with No and Low Code. Available right now for download at dzone.com. Amidst a global shortage of developers and the pressing need to deliver software solutions faster than ever, these types of technologies have emerged as vital tools in our tool belts. These frameworks are not just about keeping pace, but revolutionizing the way organizations build and develop software for faster deployment, greater scalability, without the need for such high levels of coding experience. We're going to explore how these technologies are making a significant impact by allowing more code to be written faster and by more people, addressing that developer gap and enhancing productivity across all industries. We're going to dive into how embracing these tools are transforming the software development landscape and driving innovation in an area of rapid change. But before we get started, let's do some introductions. I'm Jesse, Chief Technologist here at Dzone, and your moderator for today's discussion. With me is a distinguished panel of experts, each bringing a wealth of knowledge and a unique perspective. So first of all, we have Keenan. Keenan's the Technical Product Marketing Manager over at Retool. Hey, thanks for coming. All right, we have Eric, Programs Practice Manager at Hit Subscribe. Eric, say hey. And Stelios, Lead Software QA Engineer at Transifex. So, fellas, thanks for taking the time to join us today. I want to start off a little bit digging into where the industry is. So, y'all familiar with Gartner? And they say by 2025, which is just a couple years away, 70% of applications within all organizations will have been built using low or no code. Do you think that's really going to happen? Like it's a year and a half. Let's just be lenient, right? I said a couple years. Do you really think it's going to happen? All right. Who wants to go first? Keenan, what do you think?
Sure, I can take this one. I think we're obviously seeing the rise of these low and no code tools. And even with, some of the AI tools that are coming out now, writing, full code applications is getting even easier. So I think we look at it as kind of the lines are blurring between, what is traditionally like an app that's developed
Mhm.
with full code and some of these tools that are low and no code. And what people are really focusing on is what can, have the app that is in my mind, like be a real existing thing on the internet and producing value for people. And so I think that we're definitely seeing an increase in that low and no code space just because it's allowing people to build the things they want to build and share them with the world faster.
Okay. And Eric, what do you think? You think we're going to be there? Like 70% seems high to me.
70% seems high, but I think similar to what Keenan said, how do you define app? How many apps can exist because of these tools that wouldn't, because as you mentioned earlier, they couldn't even hire a developer. They even if they
Yeah.
had the budget, they might not find a developer to actually do the work. So if you look at, just a low code form and the ability to, fire up a simple CRUD app or
Mm.
point at a couple of REST APIs, with a lot of the tools we have that, the worst thing you might have to do is fill out a little JSON object and you're up to the races. That could be a lot of apps that just would not exist by the end of 2025
That's a
without
good
those tools.
point. I didn't even think about that. Stelios, you agree with these guys?
I agree basically, and I like the way they put it. Basically, both Keenan and Eric put it in a very nice way. To be honest, I would say 70% in a year's time. It sounds like a lot, to be honest, but you never know. You never know. I mean, I
Yeah.
would say let's wait for another year and see what happens. It's obviously growing. It's a thing that's continuously growing. More and more apps are developed that way, bringing questions like, what's an app? Very, very interesting question. But it remains to be seen, I guess.
Okay. And we're going to get into some of that a little deeper, especially like what is an app? Eric, question of the day, right? What is an app? But before we get there, because there's all kinds of things that we're going to talk about. We got techniques, we've got AI integration, how all this stuff plays into what we're doing, whether it's testing or adopting new technologies, integrating it with existing technologies. But before we define what an app is, I want to take a look at what is a developer. And so Don't laugh, don't laugh. We'll behave. But we did actually survey and have some data around this. So how is the question we had in the survey? How do the majority of developers feel about low code, right? Giving, our audience is enterprise developers, the people, hi, y'all watching this right now. It's not a shock to see that most respondents describe themselves as either back end or full stack, with 7% describing themselves as a quote citizen developer. So, how does your organization, and Keenan, we'll start with you, define developer? Like, what are the key characteristics of what you would call a developer?
Sure. Like I noted before, I think we kind of think about anybody who builds and deploys software as a software developer. Like they're someone who is developing software. I
Mhm.
think the distinction lies less for us in like what method they're using to develop that software and more in like, are they actually building and shipping things that either they themselves find useful or people directly around them in their organization find useful? And that's where we're really seeing the rise of these citizen developers. I think like in the early days of the internet, you saw people reaching for code and like learning CSS when they wanted to customize their MySpace or whatever. And I think a lot of these low and no code tools are kind of a really nice on ramp to that for a lot of folks who don't want to go in and learn an entire framework or a new programming language, but they're okay with using a little bit of JavaScript or figuring out how to put some Python here and there to get data in the shape that they want it. So that's kind of how we think about that.
Okay. Stelios, agree?
We define developers the old-fashioned way still, you know,
Hmm.
backend developers. Well, do you write code, and what code do you write? For example, there's a guy that says, "I'm writing Selenium code. I'm writing Cypress code." Nah, that guy is not a developer. So it's that you start laughing. I see. So it can go on and on and on and on like this. With backend people talking with front-end people about JavaScript, about Python, about Java. But one thing I have to say is that with all those developments going on, and I just realized I used the word developments, all those advancements I wanted to say, you have to broaden your scope, you have to think about people who work with software artifacts in general. They could be project managers that write that kind of code. They could be testers that write the kind of code. I think it's a broader idea.
Okay. Eric, you agree?
I agree. I'm going to answer in two parts if I can. At Hit Subscribe, where we're creating content, when we create a piece of content, we have a brief, and one of the things that you put in there is who's it for? And of course, one of those things can be developer. When we say developer there, it's really anybody who might search for this kind of information. So we're not checking your records with HR. We're not making sure you have a GitHub account. It's if you might Google how to, for crying out loud, create a box that's aligned straight in CSS, which if anybody can tell me how to do that, please, you're a developer. Part two, my previous job, I worked at a hedge fund and we have prop trading, proprietary trading. We had traders that wrote code, lots of code, very often in Python. And as a support person, I would have to support them. And I'm a developer with, I don't know, it can't be 30 years because that would make me old experience. And I would be able to figure out their code. They were writing stuff I didn't understand. They were deep in the weeds in mathematics and algorithms that I couldn't understand, but they weren't developers, and the developers would make fun of them.
Yeah.
And I think that really says something there, that this gatekeeping is kind of silly.
Agreed.
If I might have to fix something that they made, they were a developer and my problem.
Okay. So follow-on question, then I want to get into some data. But my son, he's my oldest son, he's 21. He's got his, coding degree and he's developing. He and I were talking about this one afternoon because I'm not sure that I agree that Python's a coding language, which is a completely different subject. We're not gonna get into that. It's not compiled, but he asked a question. He said, "Isn't everyone a developer?" With ChatGPT, you can become a developer really quickly. You can look at code, you can figure out how to deploy it, right? And it was fascinating to me to think that through because our experiences help define that. And I thought that was interesting, especially Kina, where you started. But the data that we have in our report suggests that full stack developers, or those traditionally full stack developers, tend to work more with low code environments than the backend developers, right? Full stack developers report using low code all the time, 18%. and often at 27, but back-end developers are at 4 and 13%. So do you think this matches up with your experience? And if so, why?
Yeah, I can take this one. I think a lot of the low code and no code tools traditionally at least have been very focused on the like, here are all of our components. You can drag and drop them on to this canvas and line them
Yeah.
up however you want, and then figure out how to
Yeah.
connect them. And that doesn't super match, at least in my experience, with how backend developers think about things. The early part of my career, I wrote a lot of PHP and was not very front end focused at
Ooh.
all. And so
Yeah.
that it's just kind of a mindset shift. Whereas I think if you're classified as a full stack developer, if you refer to yourself that way, you're much more comfortable kind of going back and forth between the back end and the front end, which is what a lot of these no code and low code tools require you like to have that sort of mindset. That said, I think it'd be interesting to look at this in a year or two, because a lot of products, including us at Retool, are kind of shifting a little bit more to cater to those sorts of backend developers. We have a product called Retool Workflows, which is basically not a ton of UI, but just like set up the logic steps that you want to work through, and things can run in that way. And I've seen a lot of other people in the space doing something similar. So I do think there's the shift kind of happening in that direction for sure.
Okay, that makes sense to me. What about you, Eric? Makes sense.
Yeah. When I was thinking about this question this morning, what kind of hit me is, because I've been more back end than anything else. What's a norm? What's Ruby on Rails?
Oh,
If I write a CRUD app using Ruby on Rails, is that low code?
it's lower. It's at least lower, right?
But it is in fact I'm
Any
giving
model. Yeah.
Right. I'm giving it a model and it's spitting out most of the code, and 9 times out of 10, maybe I have to add a couple little callbacks here and there and I'm done. So I kind of wonder if low code's been around a lot longer than we think.
Oh man, you're going to get into libraries in C and C libraries.
And then the other one I thought of was Terraform. Right? A simple YAML file. Again, if I'm staying inside the lines and I'm doing a no-brainer Lambda deploy to AWS, what's happening? I'm using English-like grammar to have it do a bunch of stuff on my behalf. That's kind of like what low-code tools do. And I have to say, so, we could really cause a lot of trouble here because Python's not compiled, neither is JavaScript. But, is a guy who writes somebody in Terraform a developer? DevOps, I don't know. So I think that to me, this comes back to broadening the definition of what a developer is.
Yeah.
Similar to, like part of me this morning, I was thinking like, defining an app. Is it an app if it doesn't have CI/CD? I'm like, oh, okay, then half of Wall Street that isn't using CI/CD
Sure.
isn't really using apps. So we can't do that. Well, is it really an app if it has tests? Oh my God, don't go there. But so I think that I as soon as I saw that more front end developers than back end developers use no code, I was kind of calling BS.
Okay, so you feel like it's everywhere. Okay.
Yeah, it's everywhere. Yeah, it might be more prevalent in one than the other, but I can't remember the numbers. One of them was like only 7% of back-end developers. I'm like, get out of here. Come on, you guys are lazier than that. If somebody gives you a tool that's going to do some of the work, you're going to use it.
That's experience talking. That's that experience.
Yep.
All right, Stelios, what do you think? You agree with all this?
The way that Eric put this got me thinking, because he asked some very, very nice questions. He got me thinking, okay, what about low code, the term low code? When was it first introduced? If I'm not mistaken, it was back in 2014. Was it Forrester Research? Some sort of
one of those reports,
and a report. And then I was thinking like, but that was not the birth of low code. Low code platforms were before that, at least a decade before that. So what is low code? Well, very nice question. And how low is low? What do we mean by low, actually? Like you said before. Guys, I don't know. I don't know, but what I do know is that from the experience with my colleagues, if you talk with a full stack developer, a guy who works across the stack, front end, back end, maybe the more they work across the stack, etc. This does not mean that in back end you haven't got many opportunities for optimization. So there are many things to do. But I think that I can understand the trend that full stack developers are more they're more strong. They have more strong feelings about using low code. I can understand that.
I think, and I tend to agree with Keenan in his first point that there's just a lot more tools available for front end. I mean, if we look at the benefits of one of the reasons you got low code is one, you might not have the skill set for somebody to know at Apple when they released their HIG, their human interface guidelines for when you were building those apps. But you can get an interface that allows you drag components onto a canvas and snap it to a grid that has those interface guidelines built into it automatically, right? So saving time, making up for skills. So those are, we talked a little bit about those benefits, but I think it's interesting. Eric, I think you're driving the point that all developers benefit equally and low code's been around forever. So kind of as we're wrapping, this section, are there any other benefits for developers? I think speed is one, right? And skill set's another. What else do y'all think developers are getting from these low code environments? Why do you think that they're growing?
Reduced errors.
Okay.
Like when you think about when you were talking about the GUI tools, which, like I said, I loathe it. I've had to do it, and I love when I had drag and drop tools because I'm going to mess up. I haven't been doing that for 30 years. So if I can drag on a menu and just define the callbacks and where it's going to go, I don't know how many lines of code that I would have screwed up that
Yeah.
weren't there. Same with an ORM, right? We can all write SQL in our sleep. Unfortunately, many of us do. And when the ORM does that work for us and it's been tested,
Yeah.
that's where I think these tools benefit. Our huge benefit to us is in just reducing the errors and boilerplate, tedious, repetitive work that we don't have to do. Just like with libraries, right? Just like with the
Yeah,
standard
it's
C
awesome.
library or the JDK. It's what stuff some guy did it, somebody tested it, it works.
That's
Same thing
awesome.
I think with no code, low code.
And for the back end though too, Keenan, if you'll expand on that, like I'm super
Sure.
curious as to some of the value. It's easy for me to grok. There's an old term for y'all. It's easy for me to grok the benefit to the front end, full stack. But for these back end guys, what you're working on, like what are some of these value pieces that we're adding to the equation for them?
Well, another thing that we see, like similar to what Eric was talking about before, where he was having to deal with traders code that, wasn't documented clearly or that he couldn't easily pick up. Like we see a ton of, like, if your team has a lot of folks onboarding or different folks managing like a central process, using some of these tools can make that onboarding process and getting familiar with something that's running much more transparent than saying, hey, here's this cron job that's running, once a week and it's like an old Python script or something. We need you to like look at it and make sure it keeps running and kind of have visibility into that as a new team member. So I think that, as these tools start to grow and other teams, other folks have input to them and need to manage them, it can be, easier and more transparent to manage and maintain in some of these tools versus, having a script that is checked in somewhere or running on a server somewhere that
Yeah.
folks don't have as much visibility into.
That's cool. All right, I want to switch gears real quick. So you're familiar with the geometric proclamation that a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. So is no code low code and low code is not no code? Or is it more complicated than that? And Stelios, you can go first.
That's a nice one. Okay, I think. Okay, I was thinking about it earlier on about that question. Is it or is it not? Well, I don't think it's a yes or no. I think it's about what do they actually do. It's all about no code and low code. It's all about writing less code. So it's like a continuum. It's like it's not a binary thing, I think. So low code is about using less code, but no code is using even lesser code or no code at all.
Okay.
So I think it's in that way, it's like saying that no code is a part of low code. That's how I get it at least. On the other hand, you have to take into account things like, for example, to who is it for? It's about people who are citizen developers. It's about people who have no background. It can be used by obviously by developers who have no Java, Python, etc., etc. But I think it's not just is it or is it not. It's the way I see it, that it's a part the one is a part of the other. No code is a part of the low code, I think.
Yeah, and about, I mean, if you looked at the numbers, right, about half of those, 53%, fall in the same camp as you. 32 said they're completely separate, and 16% didn't care. But what we found again was that full stack developers had a stronger opinion on the matter than backend developers. Again, there is this interesting divide that we're seeing. So 14% of those with no opinion versus the 22% from backend developers, right? So this distinction between low and no code may be predicated on the familiarity with the practice of such a thing, right? That, we've kind of been talking about. They've seen it longer, it's been around longer for front ends and back ends. So maybe their experience demonstrated that no code solutions offer less flexibility and customization compared to low code stuff, which the low code at least allows you to extend and customize applications with some code, as you need, the whole break glass kind of a concept, and get right down to the bottom. So, as we're talking about this, what are your experiences with no code and the overlap between the two? I mean, it's a little bit of nuanced, but I think it's interesting as we lay the foundation before we get into some of the inaction pieces. So, Keenan, what do you think?
Sure. Yeah. I think what we see with no code tools in particular is, like you mentioned, there's a lot of tension between developers who are trying to use those tools and in their actual use, because it can feel a little bit restrictive if you're used to just being able to, write whatever code you want and deploy it anywhere. Like, if you have to work within the bounds of this tool, it can definitely feel a little bit restrictive. And so I think that's just a mismatch. Like, those aren't necessarily the tools that are pointed at that particular audience, which is where like low code starts to come in, right? You talked about those break glass moments. Like in Retool, we call them escape hatches. Basically, any component that you drag on the canvas, you can like escape hatch with JavaScript and write whatever kind of underlying transformation logic or whatever you need to. And that's much more compatible with like developers who want to build things faster, but also don't want to be like completely restricted. And so I draw a bit of a more stark line between no code and low code, because no code to me is like, you're not writing any code at all. Everything's just a configuration of this UI somehow. But with low code, that's where we start to see folks enjoy a bit more of that flexibility to customize things themselves, which, as we know, developers love to do. So
yeah. Yeah. And why do we always use emergency references, escape hatches and breaking glass? I don't know why. Because so Eric, same kind of question as you're thinking about this stuff. Does that kind of line up with you before we get to the inaction piece?
Yeah, I think that it lines up. I mean, I don't have a strong opinion over which is which, how do you classify them? But I definitely would say what Keenan said, that with low code, if you feel restricted by it, then it probably wasn't designed for whatever you're trying to use it for.
Yeah.
You've got that square peg and that hammer.
The follow-up question for you then, if there's no code to code and no code, are they coders? I'm kidding.
My Zen Roshi there.
Yeah, well, it's just fascinating, right? Because, to Stelios's point, like no code falls under low code because it's just the absolute zero of, or on the scale. But what's interesting, I think it's really critical to discuss, all of this theory aside, is how this impacts development processes, right? So let's figure out how we're actually using this stuff in the field, right? We wanted to understand developers' opinions on how they affect their overall software development lifecycle. And our findings showed that significantly more respondents, so 41%, said their experience has shown low-code tools to result in higher quality software. Eric, back to your point, than those who said low code resulted in the same or lower quality, so 24%. So do you believe that low code or no code impacts the quality of your software? I know we already know that Eric does, so I'll let you go first on this one. And the development processes at your organizations, and if so, how?
With me.
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, assuming that tool was well tested and it's being used correctly, I would almost say, how could it not? Right. So you're connecting, the past couple of years for me, it's been mostly connecting REST APIs to each other. And it says on the tin that it's for connecting, I don't know, MailChimp to Asana. Right. And that's been tested well, and it does that well. It's going to work, assuming it was set up correctly. And the thing is, it's funny to look at that now, but you know, a few years ago, you would have had to hire somebody, and you would have had to have them hook it up, and you would have had to worry about when Mailchimp got bought by Intuit and changed all their APIs, or I don't know if Asana changed hands and all that. If you're relying on a reliable vendor, and of course, there's always that catch, it should make things more robust. I think where I would be worried, and I haven't seen this in the wild, maybe Keenan or Stelios have, would be when we're mixing low and no code tools with homegrown code. How does that affect our testing and our harnesses? That would be my concern.
Okay.
Like, and maybe it's overblown. I'm just thinking about it very abstractly. Is I've got another external dependency in my testing now.
Yeah.
How does that work in UAT? What if I have my UAT doesn't have access to the public internet and I need to get out to a third-party tool? Do I have to account for that? Or if I'm using internal tools that rely on API versions, that is another dependency, right? It's just like bringing in another library and via NuGet or Maven that I have to worry about. That would be where I would be curious to see how that affects things.
Okay, well, there you go. Stelios, what about your perspective on all this?
I would agree 100%. I would agree. Okay, it's just to rephrase. I'm going to say exactly the same thing, but I'm just going to rephrase. It's like it's about standardization and consistency. It's like you're using a local platform, yeah. And what is it? It's often a pre-built template, yeah. So you got some components that adhere to best practices and standards. As long as that's true, then quality is going to be better, yeah. If it's not, or maybe if things are not there as you wish, for example, it's like you're using a test tool that it's not reliable. If that's the case, things are going to be worse. But usually, the way that I've found things work out, it's all of the low-code platforms, they belong to those standards. You know, they are pre-tested, pre-built templates that adhere to best practices. So things are usually, you know, they actually improve the quality of the software.
Okay, so assuming that it does, right? You know, Eric's things notwithstanding, Keenan, for you, how would you suggest that companies approach the whole idea of changing a mindset that's super slow to change for some developers? I mean, I know guys and gals that are just staunch. You know, like to Eric's point, I can never trust a company. Who knows what bugs they have in it, right? So, I mean, there's that stuff, right? And so, how would you convince these practitioners of the nuances within low-code technology to make this shift?
Yeah, it's definitely, you know, you're just kind of shifting the risk in that scenario that you just outlined, right? From like bugs that you own because it's code that you wrote versus like bugs that someone else owns that you don't really have as much control over when they'll fix them, how they'll fix them, et cetera.
Yeah.
But what we try to tell folks, like from our perspective, is like we're building like little tools and things, just prototyping even internally. And just like the speed at which it allows you to take your idea, make it into something real, and use it for the use case that you were imagining, and give you a lot of information about whether it's immediately and fully useful, meaning that like you built the thing exactly to spec, which we know how often that happens, whether it's useful but not entirely what you need and you can just like use those built-in tools to iterate more quickly, or whether it's not exactly what you needed in the first place and this tool is not going to be as good of a fit. And by shortening that cycle of uncertainty of like not knowing whether the thing you're kind of brainstorming and thinking about is going to be useful, you know, you can really start to get a lot of people on board with, we can have this idea and have a useful working tool that's delivering value to us in the business in, you know, hours or days rather than weeks or months. And so we find that when folks start to try these tools, they very quickly find the boundaries of what they're good for and what they're not. And for the things they're good for, you know, they're really good, and a lot of their programming knowledge kind of carries over into these tools and it lets them move even faster.
That's awesome, and a fantastic segue. We're going to shift that question right over to Stelios. So, what do you think is most useful for low code? Like, what are those use cases that are super useful and those that don't make any
use
difference?
cases for low code, the ones that obviously need to be automated. Yeah, I think they're the best candidates for low code. The ones that need not too much customization, they are also good use cases. Because on the contrary, if you need to customize and customize and customize, it may be a point where there is no benefit. It becomes so complex that things may turn out to be too complex. So
Yeah.
you may say, in that case, I wouldn't actually use it. Business process automation, for example, that's a use case that I think it's very, very popular, because there are businesses that could, automate from HR onboarding processes to invoice processing, like, for example, approvals and notifications, to complex workflows spanning multiple departments and systems. Whatever processes there are that are stable, and we know that we need to automate them, yeah, I think they are good candidates to be automated.
Okay. And that starts to line up with what we saw. So for us, we had this question in the survey, and it said that, among the primary use cases and benefits, first were web forms, right? Nobody wants to handwrite a web form ever again as long as we're here. That was 66%. Two, agreed with Stelios, business process automation at 56%. Eric has already said it, which is CRUD operation. So any type of enterprise CRUD at 54%. So these are kind of the top. Is there anything that you would add to this list? Like anything that you want to kind of grow and get up in there in the next 6 to 12 months? Eric, go ahead.
CI/CD,
Oh,
continuous integration, continuous deployment or delivery.
okay.
If you think about it, Jenkins, as soon as it added the I'm forgetting that grammar. They added that one grammar to it for writing automation processes, was, in my opinion, low code, because you are more or less calling Java libraries, not Gradle. It's the one Gradle
Yeah.
uses. And like more recently, CloudBees has their release orchestration tool, which is essentially a low code release orchestration tool. I think that's a big one. And another area where the back end guys could kind of come clean on the fact that, if they're doing their jobs, they're doing low code stuff. That would be a big one. And for me, I will say, to back up what Stelio said, with a lot of the content I'm producing for Hit Subscribe has been about using low code for business process automation.
Okay.
Which means somebody in my company said, hey, people are searching for this. Because that's why we write the content, because somebody was searching for it. So there are people looking for ways to tie HR to Salesforce, to things like that. That here again, a decade ago, it would have been a development team. It would have been a cost line,
Yeah.
and testing and all that.
That's amazing. So I want to move into more of this process automation. So about half, 47% of our respondents said their organization uses low code tools for workflow process automation, which is a decrease from the 60% we saw in our 2023 survey. So response rates for no, but we're considering it increased to compensate from 11 to 24%. And there was really no change in the rates for no, we're not considering it, and I don't know. Those stayed the same. So considering we did not see a decrease in the low code tool usage year over year, in this survey, it's unclear why so many fewer respondents this year claimed their organization uses low code tools for workflow and process automation, but it's a trend that we're going to keep our eye on. Any thoughts on that? Any theories?
Yeah, I can take this one. I think for us, we think about this as, especially with the advent of all of the AI tools that were coming out around the same time. I think people got a ton of exuberance around, like, great, all of these tools are going to be able to automate all these pieces of my business that I don't really want to do, or I don't want to take on, don't need to be done manually. And I think now we're seeing just kind of a pullback, and like, yes, it can automate a lot of those, but to the point that I think Stelios was making earlier, like, if your business process isn't well defined, like, there's not going to be a tool that magically automates that for you. And so I think folks started realizing some of those boundaries of the actual kind of real world portions of the problem that they were encountering, and are starting to better understand like how these tools fit, and again, like which use cases they're really good for, and where they struggle a bit more. And you might have to do some more, real world in-person sort of work to get it into a place where it's useful for these tools.
You got to have the things to automate in order to automate them. I get it. Yeah.
Yep.
Makes sense. So respondents also said they've built software with low code tools most frequently, like either often or all the time, were significantly more likely than others to see that low code has made software faster, 36%, right? More maintainable, 65%, more scalable, 53%, more secure. So security is popping up here, 55%. So since many of these platforms are made specifically for kind of rapid prototyping, quick to market types of things, allowing developers to continuously refine and improve these applications based on immediate, like super fast feedback. These results kind of line up with expectations, right? So we see this extensive experience working with tools leads to more positive outlooks on their potential, right? So the more you use them, the better your results are going to be. So as we look forward, this is our last question I want you three to weigh in on. Where do you see these emerging challenges facing low code like over the next year, right? And specifically around quality, is it going to plateau or is it only going to grow and get better? Right? And are these systems going to help us with more of the things like Stelios was saying, the complex? Like, what do you think is really going to happen over the next 6 to 12 months? Where do you think we're going to be 6 to 12 months from here? And Stelios, we'll start with you, bud.
Sure. One emerging nuance I would say would be customization limits. I mean, how much can those platforms customize to whatever specific use case a customer has? That's one thing that I would like to see. Another nuance is integration with emerging technologies, like obviously AI, machine learning. How much are these platforms going to integrate with these new technologies? To what extent? How much are they going to be helpful for everyday use cases? Now about the plateau that we said. I think that it's going to continue, those platforms, the local platforms and no-code platforms, they're going to continue improving software quality because of, I think, integration capabilities are going to improve as well. New features are going to be built on those platforms that are going to help even more the integrations with various types of systems. I mean, the main reason that I see behind this, if you think about it, is that because low-code platforms, what they do in a sense that they abstract away much of the underlying complexity of coding. If you think about it, so they basically allow developers to focus on business logic and user experience. I think that's a game changer.
Yeah.
Now, this can lead to fewer errors, like we've said before. Yeah, more robust applications.
Yeah.
There's a growing community as well towards low code, I think.
Okay, Eric, what do you think?
So
Where we
yeah,
going?
I think there is the potential for things to get much better, especially in the next year.
Okay.
The promise of you can focus on business logic has been around as long as at least OO, if not structured programming. But this actually does kind of hit it, right? When you look at some of these tools,
It does,
right?
yeah.
When you're tying together your CRM and your whatever your product delivery system, that's what you're doing, right? And one of the things an experienced developer learns, and I think it depends on at what point in your career you hit this, is you stop focusing on the code and you start focusing on the data. And that's what a lot of these low code tools can do, right? Is you can look at, get this message to this place. And I think that's where many of the tools I've seen are already doing that. What I would be worried about, somebody has to have something to worry about, is improving security. Is that because they just haven't been a target yet? And when we're taking a lot of these tools and connecting, OAuth domains and stuff like that, is it just because nobody's bothered to hit it yet? And what happens if one of these platforms does get hit? How bad is that going to be? So I would kind of worry that people would kind of forget about security and not be thinking about it as they use these tools to tie systems together. And I think that's more of a concern for the external vendor-based tools than it is for the internal development-based tools. But that would be one thing I would worry about, would be security.
Gotcha. All right, wraps up, Keenan.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see is, like, we've talked a lot about how these tools let you prototype really quickly, but as Retool has a lot of customers that are more than just like one person kind of tinkering around in their internal tools department, and so we've started to have to think a lot about, like, how do we do things like version control? How do we allow for automated testing? And like, what concepts from the traditional kind of software development lifecycle can we pull over into tools like ours, but yet still make it accessible to folks who, don't understand or know really what a unit test is, or how they just want to make sure that this particular like flow of their software consistently works. So we think about that sort of thing a lot. I think in terms of like where do we see the plateau of low code versus like full code, I think it's useful to look at the analogy of like how spreadsheets and SQL kind of have coexisted, right? Like obviously spreadsheets are in a lot of ways a more low code version of what you could do with a database. And some folks, for better or worse, use spreadsheets that way. But as like the ability to do formulas and calculations and all that stuff in a spreadsheet has gotten a lot more advanced, like you've kind of approached like what you can do with a database sort of language like SQL or something else. But in a tool, it's a lot more accessible to most folks. And so I think as we see these like low code tools continue to develop, the lines between what you needed to write, code an entire application yourself to do versus what you can do in these tools are going to continue to blur, and they're each going to make each other more powerful.
Wow. Well, thanks for joining us today. You guys were awesome. Thank you to everyone out there for watching. A special thanks to Retool for sponsoring this. You heard it here first. Low code's been around since the 80s. Eric said it. And everyone is a developer with AI now. So, but really, seriously, thanks everyone for tuning in. It was a great time exploring these new technologies that we're still on the front end of this thing. We're going to see this expand over the next year or two and start to make a bigger difference and accelerate development in all areas, which is super exciting. So if you're out there and you enjoyed this discussion, you want to see more talks just like this, head on over to dzone.com/events to see all of our on-demand content. Also, stay on the line for just one more minute and take a quick survey. We're always trying to do better. Until next time, keep innovating.